This episode is brought to you by Early Innings, an anthology of the first 4 years of the Twin Bill. Featuring over 200 pages of baseball poetry, short stories, essays, interviews, comics, and art, it tells the story of what it means to love baseball today. The Athletic's Tyler Kepner said, like a box of ballpark Cracker Jack, there's a delightful surprise on every page of the Twin Bill's Early Innings. This is a collection to be savored, a loving and lyrical celebration of the art of baseball. Early Innings is available now from 406 Press. This episode is also brought to you by Ben Shahan's Short Relief. It asks the question of what happens when men are not ready to give up that boys' game, the national pastime. In 9 stories, he traces the stories of a minor league pitcher holding on to his last shred of hope for promotion to the show, little leaguers' formative experiences, and a host of men and boys in between. Short Relief is out on 406 Press and available at 406press.com. Welcome to the Twin Bill Podcast. I'm your host, Scott Bolohan. The 1985 World Series between the Royals and Cardinals is probably one of the more forgotten ones. If anything, people probably remember the blown call by Don Denkinger. But Marshall Garvey's book, Interstate 85, hopes to change that. And it pretty convincingly argues there was so much more than just the call. It was a truly surprising series that features some fascinating characters. We had a great chat. Enjoy. Welcome to the podcast, Marshall. How you doing today?
I am doing great. This is a podcast I've been really excited to be on, and I always love talking about this book and this specific topic. It's an underrated World Series and a lot of underrated concomitant history that it's been buried for a long time, but especially now that we're in the 40th anniversary, it's the perfect time to uncover it all again. So excited to talk.
So I always start the podcast off by asking, where did this idea initially come from for you?
I've always been into baseball history since I was a kid. I'm a lifelong Californian, second generation Dodgers fan, so I'm not a Royals or Cardinals fan, so it's not personal for me in that way. But I've always known about the 85 series since I was a kid. You know, I always knew, of course, about the call. Everyone knows about the call. It's one of the defining moments in baseball. And the 85 series just always just kind of stuck in my mind in kind of a different way than other World Series. I think largely because of the controversy over the call. But for 20 years, it just kind of rattled around there. But then, well, the wheels of fate, history itself would set it all in motion. April 15th, 2020, that's 1 month into COVID lockdown. I realized that I was going to be hunkered down. I was working as a full-time remote writer already anyway. I'd recently finished and published my first baseball history book. And I realized, well, it's time to get the gears turning on the second. My buddy Jay Daniel was working on a book about the 1982 World Series. That's Cardinals and Brewers. I had that as like kind of my train of thought, and as I started my daily run late afternoon that day, and my train thought goes to 85, and it's just like exploded in my mind. I was like, no one's really written about this. This could be it. So I spent the rest of that run just kind of hashing out the idea, like, yeah, there's various angles you could do, explore to this series and show there's more than the call. I came up with the title Interstate 85 while listening to Thunder Road by Bruce Springsteen. I know that it's just like excruciatingly basic for a baseball writer to be inspired by Bruce Springsteen, but that was still a really good omen.
Yeah, you're not the first.
Yeah, certainly not the first, and will not be the last. But yeah, the story of the book's development, yeah, I say this in the least self-aggrandizing way. I could write a book about the making of the book. It was a crazy journey with a lot of ups and downs, but ultimately, my belief that there was more to the 85 series than the call turned out to be right as I developed it.
So you mentioned you're a Dodgers fan. You were not alive during this World Series. What did you know about it before you started this project?
In addition to the call, I did know some other basic things. I knew about Joaquin Andujar's infamous meltdown in Game 7. That's kind of an image that's like really emblazoned in my mind. There's like one picture of him, you know, blowing up at Denkinger. He's got like his fist cocked like he's going to throw a punch, and like a bunch of coaches and Terry Pendleton are restraining him. I knew the Cardinals made a really big comeback in Game 2, which was a devastating loss for the Royals to put them down 0-2. I knew the basics of the Royals and the Cardinals, more or less. I knew certainly about the playoffs, the Royals beating the Blue Jays and the Cardinals beating the Dodgers. But the deeper I dove into the 85 series, like, there was so much more that just doesn't get talked about. So many things, and we can save these for other parts in the podcast, but like the first and only immaculate inning in MLB postseason history was in Game 5. I didn't know that. So I knew, maybe I thought I knew more than I did before I started researching the book. But once I researched, and certainly when I started conducting interviews with people from it, then I really realized how much there was to it.
It's interesting, you're listening to Thunder Road. You come up with the idea for the title, Interstate 85. There is this kind of road, I don't know, symbolism or something throughout the book, I suppose you could say. I mean,
Mhm.
the book is not just the 85 World Series. It kind of is a road to and after the World Series
Yep.
as well. Did that come pretty organically for you? Where did this sort of idea for the symbolism of the road throughout the book come?
Well, I am so over the moon that you asked that question, because that's actually a perfect illustration of how the book evolved throughout its difficult development over those 5 years. And you would think right there, the imagery of Interstate 70 and listening to Thunder Road, like I would have really, I seized on that imagery, how Interstate 70 connects Kansas City and St. Louis. But at the beginning, my thesis for the book was pretty basic. It was just like the overlooked stories of the 85 series. Yeah, but then I actually put the book on hiatus in 2022, just to kind of focus on some personal things, whatnot. But when I got back to the book in January of 2020, that's when I realized the thesis about roads. It's about the individual and collective roads of the Royals, Cardinals, and Don Jankinger, how they came to the 85 series, what happened during it, and then where they went afterwards, all the way up to 2015 when the Royals finally won it again. So, yeah, that realization of the road theme and imagery, yeah, I didn't fully realize that until I started the book again in 2023. And when I did, it was an amazing moment. And that's when I realized how to overcome certain roadblocks and pull the book together once and for all.
You started this during the pandemic. I think a lot of people were like, "Hey, this is my time. This is how we started the Twin Bill and everything." It was like, "This is my time to dive into something." And I imagine it's a very similar way for you. You're doing interviews over Zoom, I can only assume. I don't think you're probably not traveling that much at the time. What does go into this research process? How does it all come together? Mostly secondary sources, mostly interviews. Where Walk me through your research process a little bit if you can here.
Oh, for sure. Well, so with interviews, I did interviews in 2021 and 2023. There were 27 of them, 26 by phone, one by email. So I didn't get to do any in person, but I'm okay with that. It didn't. Every single one had a great connection. The research process is interesting. While the interviews are the main thing, and it's so exciting to talk to all these cool baseball heroes, especially George Brett and Ozzie Smith, the thing that really pulled it together was secondary research. I would say the two keys, it wasn't linear either. Like, I would just do lots of searches on individual things, and that could branch out in certain ways. Certainly combing through newspapers.com and watching clips on YouTube, like watching game broadcasts and kind of feeding off of that. Maybe an announcer spills a certain tidbit about a player, and I kind of dovetail off of that. I also used magazines, books by people from the 85 series. I used Willie Wilson's book, Whitey Herzog's book, things like that, Frank White's book. It was a very sweeping process. I don't know if I can really convey the entirety of it in one setting, but I would say, you know, in addition to the interviews are the main thing that determined where the narrative went and where I could put those in. But I would say newspapers and TV broadcasts would be the primary guiding northern lights for the secondary research. So there was a lot of.
Obviously, it's pretty cool talking to Hall of Famers. Was there any particularly revealing thing that you found from doing these interviews with any of the players? Something that maybe you didn't know, not necessarily from Brett or Smith, but just from anyone you ended up talking to throughout the process?
Oh gosh, so much. The part of what I loved about all 27 of my interviews is that they were very frank and very passionate interviews. They weren't like boilerplate interviews. You notice that in the book, the way that people worded their quotes is very fresh, it's very passionate. I love that so much. I would say the most moving revelation would be Royals reliever Joe Beckwith. I interviewed him just by phone just 2 weeks before he passed away of colon cancer in May of 2021. And he told me a story, and this is prominent in chapter 3, that he was struggling in the summer of 85 during the regular season. So Beckwith came up with the Dodgers, and he was traded from the Dodgers to the Royals in 83. And who does he call to turn his season around? Who else but Sandy Koufax? And he told me this story about in Toronto before a series against the Blue Jays. He calls Sandy, and again, this is 85. This is pre-cell phone, pre-Zoom, pre-Skype. He's got a corded phone crouched against his ear and shoulder, and standing in front of the mirror with his wife, Jean Ann, who I also interviewed, watching from the bed. He's going through his motions with Sandy Koufax instructing him. And he turned his season around. He was brilliant the rest of the way. And I emphasize that because when I brought that up to Jean Ann Beckwith, she was absolutely blown away that he told me that. I kind of get the feeling he didn't tell anyone else that story until then. And I think he knew that was it because he knew he was going to die. There were lots, that's just one example. There were lots of revelatory stories from all the interviews, but that I think might have been the deepest. And that might have been the only time he ever shared that. It's amazing.
Anytime you have Sandy Koufax on the phone in a story, it's going to be a good story.
And it's also it's a great story, and also one that in a way kind of doesn't really make sense because Joe Beckwith was a right-hander and Sandy is the ultimate lefty. Like, how would they click? But they clicked and it worked.
That's incredible. So going back to that road, the idea of the road to the World Series was, I guess, how do we put this? Unexpected. So I don't think people were picking a Royals Cards World Series coming into 85. What gets these teams to the World Series? How does that road start for them?
It's true. There was no real hype for Royals and Cardinals, especially the Cardinals. There were a lot of picks that they'd finish dead last in the NL East in 85. I would say, first off, they were stable. The Cardinals were only a few years removed from winning it in 82, and I think a lot of people overlooked that. They still had a lot of players from that roster. And the Royals surged to the playoffs in 84. Got swept by the Tigers, but they still had a big turnaround from a terrible 83 season. So they're stable to begin with. But I would say the first thing, big trades in the offseason. Royals get Jim Sundberg, one of the top defensive catchers of his era, to steer their young starting rotation to dominance. And the Cardinals, because they had an offseason that looked like they were getting rid of a lot of key parts, they swing a trade for Jack Clark from the Giants to get themselves a big slugger. And then the regular seasons were very trying. Again, lots to recap, and I won't have to go through like every game and series. I would say for the Cardinals, they just had a great philosophy of Whitey ball. Old school baseball predicated on speed, pitching, defense, and contact hitting. Speed being the key once they called up Vince Coleman in April, and then he has a historic rookie season with 110 stolen bases. That really just, once that kicked into gear, especially in June, they ended up being the winningest team in MLB. The Royals were not quite as flashy. They had a really weak total offense, but their starting rotation, again, especially with Jim Sundberg able to mentor them, that starting rotation of Brett Saberhagen, Charlie Lebrand, Danny Jackson, Bud Black, and Mark Gubicza just was incredible. All young guns under the age of 30, and they just ended up being the difference maker in the stretch run. A lot of clutch wins, including a comeback walk-off win to clinch the division. That's the long and short of it. Yeah, just old school classic baseball for the Cardinals. The Royals, just great pitching and whatever offense they could scratch out.
How important was Whitey Herzog to this Cardinals team?
Indispensable. In the prior decade, when you think of the Cardinals, you think of like consistent greatness, playoffs at the minimum, championships at the maximum. The Cardinals were actually irrelevant throughout the whole 70s. They didn't make the playoffs once. They were pretty aimless and stagnant. But then when Whitey Herzog was fired by the Royals in 79, which really, in retrospect, that's still a terrible move. Herzog was enlisted by the Cardinals, and he turned them around immediately. Just blew up the roster, made a lot of trades to freshen it up, brought in, again, the Whitey ball philosophy of speed, pitching, contact, great defense, just fundamentals. Whitey was also a great communicator. He let every player know in advance what their role was going to be, and he did it pretty efficiently. Whitey Herzog was such a night and day for making the Cardinals a juggernaut again. No question about it.
Well, I think outside of Kansas City, at least, Dick Howser doesn't really get the same recognition as a Whitey Herzog. Another one of those kind of forgotten figures to some extent. I think there's some reasons for that. But what role does he have for this team?
I agree. Well, it's tragic that Dick Howser isn't more widely known. The reason for that would obviously be that he was taken by brain cancer just 2 years after the 85 series, which is just crushing. Interviewed his daughter Jana for the book. She was one of the best interviews, super sweet. Dick Howser for the Royals was great, especially because the manager before him, this is the guy in between Herzog and Howser, was a guy named Jim Fry. He managed the 1980 Royals in the World Series, but that was just the payoff for Herzog, what Herzog had built. The players couldn't stand Jim Fry. Dennis Leonard ranted to me that just like Fry was just like an overbearing second guesser. They couldn't stand him. Hauser was the exact opposite. He was like a low-key, kind of hands-off manager. He was like a quiet man. Make that reference especially because he loved John Wayne. Hauser was just very, he wasn't like a Dallas Green or a Tommy Lasorda. He wouldn't blow up and be like cartoonish and toxic. He was just relaxed. He knew how to let players kind of build their own team chemistry. Didn't really interfere. Another reason why he's not like a big caricature. There aren't like big highlight reels of Dick Howser going off on an umpire like Earl Weaver. But I think that his cool, level-headed leadership and his faith in players and bringing out the best in them, Steve Balboni in particular raved about that. I think that was a huge difference maker for Kansas City to win it all.
As you mentioned, Herzog managed very famously the Royals in the 70s to some pretty good success and then joins the Cardinals. Obviously, these two teams are pretty close by. This dawned on me, there was no interleague play. They had never played each other before. Was there much of a rivalry at that time? Was there animosity between the two clubs there?
I don't really think there was animosity. So they had met in a couple of exhibition games in the summer of 1981, but those were just that was after the strike had been resolved, and that was just to kind of thaw fans' apathy. It's really hard to say. I don't really think, especially because there were a lot of cross-pollination. There were guys that had played on the Royals that had played for the Cardinals and vice versa. I don't know if there was a whole lot of animosity between the clubs, especially if they hadn't really met before. Kansas City and St. Louis definitely have a big, long-standing rivalry. I think it's much more intense on the Kansas City side. They kind of a little brother mentality. I don't think the teams had the biggest rivalry, but the cities definitely did and still do. I think that was the emphasis that's more for the fans.
You talked about how pretty unexpected World Series. Was there kind of a turning point in the season for these two clubs that's like, oh, this was the moment where this kind of set everything into place as far as they're going to go somewhere now?
That's a great question. Well, for the Cardinals, it would have to be, it's early on, but it's definitely Vince Coleman. Vince Coleman's debut and him stealing all those bases and setting the tone for their speed attack. Like, I think once he was in place, the rest really came together. Also, the calling up Todd Worrell to boost the bullpen, trading for Cesar Cedeno from the Reds, and he provides another big bat. But if I just pick one, it's Vince Coleman. Once they kicked into gear with that. With the Royals, I would say, so the thing with the Royals is they were 7.5 games behind the Angels at the All-Star break, but they had a huge turnaround in the second half. And I think the turning point for them would be Hal McRae coming back from an injury and being full-time designated hitter. Hal was the real veteran leader of the squad, great source of hitting wisdom, and obviously a terrific hitter in his own right. So I'd say once Hal McRae got back, the offense more or less started to kick into gear a little more, and I'd say that was the turning point for the Royals.
I want to skip ahead here to the World Series. I look at the NBA Finals right now. We have Indiana and Oklahoma, two smaller markets. We had the World Series a couple years ago where you have the Diamondbacks and the Rangers, not your coastal cities. What was the thought about this World Series? Was there excitement? Was this?
I think there was definitely a lot of, at least purported bi-coastal apathy, and there were some ratings that showed it during the series. Because there was a lot of hype during the regular season for maybe a Mets-Yankees World Series, maybe a Dodgers-Angels World Series, or you have the wholesale novelty of the Blue Jays making it, so it finally gets played on a world scale in Canada outside the U.S. So I think there was definitely disappointment for having it be all Missouri. That's so hyper-specific. Missourians, however, loves that. There's plenty of commentary, I put this in the book, columnists being like, yeah, those New York big shots have to learn some Missouri geography now, and just like rubbing it in, which I loved. Thought that was really funny. I think the Cardinals were clearly the betting favorites. I think they were generally expected to win, although there were some savvy predictions that the Royals would hold their own, or even one from a St. Louis sports writer who predicted Royals in 7, and he turned out to be right. There's actually a common motif throughout the middle chapters where Cardinals fans seem to really get ahead of themselves and just preemptively declare that the Cardinals were going to win. And Andy Van Slyke told me, like, you can't really get ahead of yourself. If you're not in the moment completing your job at that level, you're not going to like the results. But overall, I think One thing I'll say is that even with the whole bi-coastal apathy, the series was still decently watched. Like game 6 had like 34 million viewers. So even with the whole, oh, it's all Midwest and that's not as interesting as Mets Yankees, baseball was still popular enough back then that people watched anyway. So
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and then the World Series starts off with 2 wins in a row for the Cardinals. And at this point, it's looking pretty good for them. Royals take game 3 and the Cardinals take the 4th game. So all of a sudden, it's a 3-1 series at this point. You kind of think at this point, we're done here. Where are the Royals' heads at this point? Where are the Cardinals' heads at this point? What's happening? It's 3-1 in the series. What's going on right now?
going into game 5 in St. Louis, anticipation in St. Louis is off the charts. Frank White and Willie Wilson were walking from the Clarion Hotel to Busch Stadium. There's blues and jazz bands braying at every corner. Frank joked to Willie, like, if we don't win tonight, we're probably going to get out of the stadium. This is going to be bedlam outside on the streets of St. Louis. Jim Sundberg told me that the atmosphere in the Royals clubhouse seemed weirdly kind of sullen or just really quiet. ABC was getting the stage ready for like post-game loser interviews. And Willie Wilson just said, take that down, we're not losing tonight. And Wilson made sure that he hit a huge triple off of Cardinal starter Bob Forsch. And that honestly put the game out of reach pretty quickly. So, yeah, I'd say whatever anticipation there was in St. Louis, there was a lot of it, obviously. It was gone very quickly. That game was a pretty easy Royal win. Danny Jackson pitched a great complete game, and then it's back to Kansas. Even though the Royals were able to live another day and get it back to Kansas City, well, now we're at game 6, and well, it's the moment you all, even though one of my points of this book was to tell more than the call, I don't gloss over the call. It's still one of the greatest moments.
Can you set the stage for the call? So, because I think this is a thing that we, and one of the theses of your book is that, think about Steve Bartman. We think about the play, not like the Gonzalez error that happened as well. Or, we kind of forget the other things that lead up to this moment happening that affect the game for either team. And we kind of focus on the one play here. Can you kind of set the stage for the call here?
Absolutely. Well, and you could say a similar thing about Bill Buckner the following year in '86. Like these scapegoat moments, there is always more that you remember both before and after. So game 6 is just a classic pitcher's duel, barn burner. Danny Cox for the Cardinals, Charlie Leibrandt for the Royals, spinning zeros. A key thing, this is one of the key revelations of my book. There was actually a blown call in the 4th inning that cost the Royals a run. It was even highlighted by the ABC announcers and replay crew. And that's a big deal because not only would the Royals go up 1-0 there, but that could turn the lineup over differently. Because in the bottom of the 9th, so anyway, with that missed call, it's scoreless. Cardinals take a lead in the 8th inning on a pinch hit by Brian Harper. I didn't know it was Brian Harper that got him the lead. I always thought he was just like a Twins catcher. That was another
right.
cool.
Yeah.
And I interviewed him. But anyway, so the Cardinals are up 1-0. There's 3 outs away from their 10th championship. And 9th inning starts with a bunch of maneuvering between Hauser and Herzog that has George Orta, aging backup, going up against Todd Worrell. We all know this. Taps a ground, but for those who don't know, Orta taps a grounder to the right side. It's fielded easily in time for Orta to be out. But Don Dankinger, first base umpire, is too close in his observation, sees the play in 2 parts, doesn't hear the pop of the ball in time because the crowd's so loud, calls Orta safe. And it's almost everyone knew he was out. It was like so obvious, but he's safe. It's a single. And from there on, the Royals just continued to rally. The Cardinals kept having miscues, dropped what would have been an easy out. Foul pop-up is dropped by Jack Clark and Daryl Porter. Steve Balboni turns that into a single. A parade of clutch heroics and errors mistakes leads to Dane Orge getting a walk-off single to force Game 7.
So as you have done throughout your research, I pulled up the play on YouTube right before we started, and I watched again. It's kind of a chaotic play in a way that Worrell's route to first base isn't great. The throw to him isn't great. I mean, if this is a smoothly handled play, I think he doesn't blow the call. There's a lot going. His hat's flying off, his helmet's all over the place. There's a lot of stuff happening at that moment for what should be a very simple play.
What you just said is so perfect because George Brett said the same thing to me in his interview. He said it just wasn't a smooth play. And it really wasn't. That's part of what I love about it. Yeah, it's just weird. The ball just withers. All the players clustering together to field it. Orta awkwardly comes down on Worrell's heel. Yeah, the throw is high, and Worrell's a tall guy. He's like, what's he like, 6'4" or 6'5", and he has to reach up. So yeah, it's in Dankinger's defense, he can't hear it because of crowd noise, and he has to look up at Worrell's outstretched arm, and then has to look down. And this is pre-instant replay, if that needs to be said. The full instant replay didn't come along until 2014. It's not a smooth play. It's obvious he was out, but I'm glad that you emphasized that. And George Brett talked about that a lot too. It really was not a smooth play at all.
No,
That's
no,
part of the
Worrell's foot's like on top of the bag. Like everything's like you would never teach someone to do that play the way that it happened. And it's funny because when I watch it in real time, there's a lot of things happening. And he's out, but it's like it's not as obvious as when you slow it down and you zoom in. You say like, oh yeah, he's out. His foot is half step away here still. I mean, it's not really even close.
It's not.
No, it's not. So honestly, I think the hero of your book ends up being Denkinger. He ends up being the star of the book here, and in ways that I didn't really expect. Let's follow the road a little bit more here. What happens with Denkinger after this play?
The Royals rally to win. Dankinger's home plate umpire for Game 7. The Royals blow out the Cardinals 11-0. Whitey Herzog and Joaquin Andujar unload on Dankinger, and they get ejected. They just make asses of themselves. But the Royals soundly win the championship. Dankinger returns to his home. This is how I start chapter 11. He returns to his quiet home in Waterloo, Iowa, with police cruisers blocking the streets. A St. Louis disc jockey released their info, and so they're getting hate mail, they're getting crank calls. Eventually, Dankinger even got a death threat in 1987, so severe he contacted the FBI. So Dankinger, he's pilloried, he's scapegoated in St. Louis as the source of blame for the Cardinals losing, which I think is ridiculous, honestly. But at the same time, Dankinger begins to realize something in that off season going into 86. This is taking on a life of its own, and he needs to embrace it. So he starts going on a speaking tour. He's talking all around the Midwest. His road includes many more years of umpiring, including a great job umpiring the 1991 World Series. Him and Brian Harper crossing paths again there. I talk about that in chapter 11. But after retirement, it reaches kind of an interesting denouement. He starts becoming kind of the beloved villain in St. Louis. He starts showing up at Cardinal nostalgia and reunion events. That doesn't mean everyone forgives him in St. Louis. He comes to the 25th anniversary dinner, and there's some booze at the beginning, but he not only learns to live with the call, but he turns it into an ironic bond with Whitey Herzog and some of the 85 guys. And then he brings it to Kansas City. He goes to the 30th anniversary 85 Royals reunion. So Dankinger, it's the odd thing where it's like he was scapegoated more than he should have been. Even Ricky Horton of the Cardinals said that to me. But he learned to live with it. He didn't grow bitter about it, grow tired of talking about it. He just learned to enjoy it as part of life. And I thought that was beautiful. Tracing that in the last 2 chapters was really fun to see that. And of course, talking to him too about it.
What was it like talking to him? I mean, I'm sure this is the thing that he gets asked about the most in the world. I mean, this is his thing now. And if he didn't embrace it so much, I can see it being a touchy subject, but I can only assume he was happy to talk about it.
He was. So I talked to him on Valentine's Day 2021, joined by his wife, Gail, and 2 of their daughters, Denise and Dana. This is 2 years before he passed away. I tried to really structure the interview to talk about other things, like how he met his wife, how he got into umpiring. I think he liked the uniqueness of the questions, but we still talked about the call, and he told me about Commissioner Ubroth telling him he got it wrong afterward and how devastated he was. Yeah, very, very nice guy. Very, very amiable, and he has a really sweet family too. So yeah, talking to Don was a real treat. He was one of the earliest interviews too, and I'm glad I got him while I could.
Yeah. When you talk to the Cardinals guys 40 years later, is there still simmering resentment there? How do they view this play now?
That is a great question, because that can vary from player to player. Ricky Horton's at peace with it. He found closure over Dick Hauser passing away. Plus, he got a ring with the 88 Dodgers. Jeff Lottie, another reliever, he got a ring with the 82 Cardinals. And he said, I'm just happy I got to see it both sides, winning and losing. It's a thrill to be there. Kurt Kepshire, the starting pitcher, he says he's still haunted by it, but because he feels he should have pitched and helped the Cardinals win. Not because he's bitter towards Dankinger. He doesn't hold on to that, really. Brian Harper still holds, I think, a reasonable grudge about it, because he would have been the hero if the Cardinals had won. So for the guys I talked to, it seemed like it varied a bit in a healthy way. I know for a number of those guys, there were others I didn't talk to. I know Todd Worrell does not like to talk about it anymore, so I didn't even bother trying to contact him. But yeah, it seemed like there's like some kind of nuance, from player to player. It's not like lockstep bitterness, and I appreciated that, seeing that difference in perspective.
Yeah. As we've mentioned the whole time here, the book doesn't end with the World Series. It follows the paths of some of these players, these franchises here, beyond the World Series into almost up to the present day here. You have two teams that make the World Series, and they don't win another World Series, either one of these teams, for, 20 years? 20 years, something like that? 30 years?
Well,
No, Cardinals win in '06. Yeah.
oh,
Yeah.
Cardinals won in '06 and another in '11, and the Royals don't win until 2015, 30 years later. So yeah, it was consequential because both of them wouldn't get that next championship for a while.
Yeah. What happens for them to not maintain that level of greatness that they were at that point? Both these teams.
Well, for the Cardinals, the key was Whitey Herzog stepped aside as manager in 1990. That era just kind of organically ended, and the owner, Gussie Busch II, passed away. And the Cardinals are aimless in the early 90s under Gussie III. So the 90s are kind of a lost decade, but they start building the infrastructure for the 2000s. Tony La Russa, Walt Jocketty, Bill DeWitt. So they turn that around in due time. In retrospect, it wasn't too long. The Royals are far more infamous. Their drop off, they kind of hang in there for a few years afterward. 86, 93, 1994, they've got a team that looks like another charm season, but we know what happened with the strike. Kills it on the vine, and that doesn't get resolved. What happened with the Royals is simple. The Kauffman Trust, Ewing Kauffman, the owner and founder of the Royals, passed away in 93, leaves the team to his estate, and the estate, headed by Walmart magnate David Glass, just gutted the team, gutted their budget, gutted their resources and player development. David Glass became full-time owner, and things got even worse. The Royals were just run with absolute neglect, and that was so opposite of what made them great in the first place. Eventually, Dayton Moore came along as general manager in 2006, and he orchestrates the rebuild that finally leads to the 2015 title, but it was a long time coming. The Royals and their fans had to grind out a lot of lost seasons to get there.
Yeah, they really, really did. When we think about this 85 World Series, it's inevitable. It'll always be the Denkinger World Series. I think that's kind of set in stone at this point. What do you want people to remember about the World Series in 1985?
I want them to remember that it was a very unique meeting between two great teams. I want them to remember lots of other heroics. Danny Jackson's immaculate inning in Game 5, Frank White's homer in Game 3, Darryl Motley's home run in Game 7. I want them to remember how special it was for the state of Missouri. The provincialism is not uninteresting. I think what it meant to the state was very special. It's basically a huge chapter in that state's prestigious history, really. I want them to remember that there was a lot more. They remember that the Cardinals were a great team. That 85 Cardinal team was worth remembering, even if they came up just short in the end. I definitely want them to and never forget the call. I know that my agenda with the book wasn't to push the call down the memory hole. I couldn't do that. It's a great moment regardless. I did it the justice it needed. But definitely remember that there was a lot of fascinating stuff before and after. And I would say people go back to that World Series and savor all those little details. It's a special, special chapter in baseball history that deserves a lot more love.
That was Marshall Garvey. His book, Interstate 85, The Royals, the Cardinals, and the Show Me World Series is out now. We talk to people in and around baseball literature every week on the podcast and publish around 50 writers every year in the Twin Bill Literary Journal. Until next time,